Thank you very much. I appreciate all of you who are coming and listening to this. I appreciate being part of your group. And before I start, I wanted to say Tucson Organic Gardeners seems to be a group that's serious about their plants, serious about their gardens, serious about sustainability. There are other groups, Tucson Backyard Gardening being a rather large one. And there's something much more dedicated and sort of focused in your group than most of the ones I see online. So I really appreciate that about you. And then I was at the plant fair. I counted 5 vendors, and I thought we had made a mistake. I thought we came on the wrong day when we first got there. But we did unbelievably well. And this is part of why I say that, is that people come up, they know what they want to do. They're, we sell worm castings and other products, and people were just unbelievable. We've been to farmers markets and here, there, and everywhere. Nothing like this. We had a very successful fair, so I really appreciate being part of it. So thank you very much for that. My wife and I started this about 7 years ago. I'll just give you a quick synopsis of that. She went to a little symposium in California with very different kinds of presentations on, oh my God, astrology and enneagrams and I don't know what all, very, very esoteric, strange things. And then one guy got up and spoke about worms. He was from North Carolina, from Boone, North Carolina, and started talking about worms. And we knew a little bit about it. We had bought earthworm castings from a woman in town who had a small operation, but we didn't know very much. And when she came back from this thing, a lot of those things were interesting to her, but she came back and the one thing she was most excited about was, hey, this thing about worms is really amazing. We got to go find out what they're doing. So we got on an airplane, flew to North Carolina. He and his wife, this man and his wife, hosted us and showed us they had a barn, about a 2,000, 3,000 square foot barn full of tanks full of worms. And it was, very crude with a hanging light bulb and a hose. And they had worm castings in their basement of their house and worm operations. So they started to tell us about the interest, about what the potential that worms had for, mitigating soil problems, handling waste, handling toxic waste, reproducing. In Australia, for example, you can build a worm composting toilet legally. If you're a contractor, you can build it in your backyard. It's code, they have codes for things like that. Australians are more practical than we are. Their worms have amazing capacities. And so we thought this could be a business. And we didn't really have a business per se, not this kind of business. And we wanted to have something that could be a business, but also had a contribution to make without any question. So there we were. And we started, they brought a lot of stuff out and brought tanks and worms and shelving and stuff. We got all this giant bunch of worms and immediately started making huge mistakes, killed off a bunch of worms, didn't know what we were doing, regrouped, started again, made more mistakes. We had other people working for us that were making more mistakes. Finally, about 2 or 3 years ago, we got everything off the ground, and with some help, and I've got a team of people helping me. We're now in business and we're serious. We are the only ones in town. If you look us up on Google, probably almost everybody that we talk to has looked us up. We're either the first ones or the second ones. There's a big company in Phoenix. I think between the two of us, we were 1 and 2, which is incredibly helpful when people are trying to find products. I think people have tried it here before and have given up. There's a woman in Oracle, Linda Lay, that used to have a company, Vermilion something. She grew worms and sold them, and I think she was very good in castings, and I think she's trying to rebuild her worm population. I just don't know what the status of her thing is. She is not in Oro Valley anymore doing that thing, so we're it. Some of you probably know enough about worms that this might be repetitious, but you probably I'll go over it a little bit, but there's well, depending on what you read, 5,000 to 7,000 species of earthworms on the planet. Of those 5,000 to 7,000, there's 5 to 7 species that are considered to be good composters. There just aren't that many. Red wigglers are the ones that we have, and they're considered to be the best. There's another kind of red worm, and then there's a thing called an Indian blue that is also very, very good composting worm. And there's some questions as to whether all the worms that are, they all look very much alike. So we've been specifically buying and getting and growing red wigglers whenever we can, but we can't absolutely swear that we don't have some of those other ones in our lineage, but not because we meant to. And I know there's one worm operation that sells blends of worms, different kinds combined. But red wigglers, they're called Eisenia fetida, is their Latin name. They come from Europe. They live in just the top few inches of humus wherever that occur naturally. So they don't live in dirt or soil per se. If they're in nature, they live in leafy, decaying organic matter. That's why Tucson is not a good environment for worms in general, as far as being in the ground. There's no way that you can grow worms out here in our native soil. We're a zone 4 soil. We're rocks and minerals and caliche. We're just not a friendly environment for worms. So we grow them indoors, and people grow them in containers and raised beds and amend the soil so that the worms have a chance to survive. They can withstand temperatures really all the way down to freezing and all the way up to conservatively about 80 degrees, but they can live actually in hotter conditions than that. And they won't necessarily thrive, but they're pretty sturdy that way. They're also physically pretty robust. I was saying earlier to a few people around that I've seen worms like fall on the floor, bounced around. They're like, little dogs. Sometimes that you can just throw them around and do things with them, or kids occasionally by mistake. Worms can stand a lot of jostling and survive it. It sometimes astounds me that the thing that they can't stand, of course, is they have to have bedding around them. They have to have cover. They have to be damped to around 70% humidity, and they have to stay in those temperature ranges. And there's a few things beyond that, but red wigglers are very, very much able to withstand heat. And the farm in Phoenix that grows worms, for example, they raise their castings and their worms outdoors in Phoenix in the summer. And they use a big shaded kind of an A-frame thing. And they have these giant wedges of soil, amended soil, and they raise worms in that soil. And, they do certain things to take care of it. We'll get into that a little bit more, but worms can live out here, but they just have to be set up for success. They reproduce they double every 3 to 5 months. The best I've been able to do is probably 5 months. They can reproduce every 3 months. They produce castings at a rate of about their weight every week, something like that we calculated. They're very good at making castings, and they're very good at reproduction. And that's why red wigglers are the choice of most people who do this. Back east, if you've come from back east, there are night crawlers. There's European night crawlers and Canadian and African, I think. They live subsurface. They live below, much deeper. They're bigger. They're also, and I don't think they can withstand heat. I think they can't take heat. So very few people use them out here, except I guess they import them for fishing purposes, but they're not the ideal thing for, as far as we're concerned, for composting. If anybody has any questions along the way here, please feel free. I don't want to lecture all night, have you all of us falling onto your laptop. What else is true about them? Their life cycles, they start in a capsule, which looks like a golden, maybe you've seen them, and it's a little golden seed that's like the shape of a lemon. And it's a beautiful metallic kind of gold color. It's not the size of a lemon, it's the shape of a lemon. They live in those for 2 or 3 weeks, the lemon gets darker and darker. And then when it hatches, they can hatch up to as many as, I've read 20, but I don't buy it, about 5 or 7 worms in the one tiny little seed, like almost a little bigger than a sesame seed. So they're tiny, tiny, tiny. Then they hatch, and they start eating and composting pretty quickly. Then after that, a few weeks later, they become full size. You can see them turn from babies to little tiny worms to adolescents. And then they develop organs, clitellum, an organ for reproduction purposes. They're hermaphroditic, so that they need to mate. They need to be literally coupled with other worms. And I think either side of those can produce an egg capsule. It happens, the egg capsule's in the band about a third of the way down from their head. It grows in there and you can see it swelling. And then they have ringed like rings on their body, and they push that thing out. It's almost like having a blister. They push it out. You can see it occasionally with worms that it'll be stuck to their skin, then it'll fall off, and then it'll hatch, and then off to the races again. And they live, and I didn't even actually know this. I thought about a year, but I've just read in several different sources, they can live to 4 to 5 years, which I think is astounding for something that small. So another reason why they're very good for, and I'm talking about in captivity, not, they're not going to live that long where the weather changes and there's predators and all that. But in captivity, if they're taken care of, they can live for a long time. So what can worms do for soil? Some of you probably already know this, or castings, I should say. They produce castings. Casting is their excrement, their poop. I'll get into the worms in a second. But castings are the gold, the golden product of worms that most people are looking for. They have chemistry, which is ideal for soil composition. And that chemistry includes a very low percentage of nitrogen. And the ratio, the Npk ratio that's mandatory on some products is sometimes it goes as high as 20 to 5 to 3 or whatever. Worm castings are 100. They're very low, very balanced and low percentage, but a lot of micronutrients, a lot of other minerals, and available for plant use is a key thing that if you talk to a lab, they'll tell you that how much is that available for plant use. And soil also, if you overload soil with certain minerals, it will actually completely reduce the ability of the soil to use other minerals. It's a complex science. Worm castings are balanced. They have the right, these things have evolved over so many thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. They're balanced to make the plant able to use the nutrition that they have in the best way possible. And that's not to say that if you have rose bushes or something that you don't add something else, but they're really an all-purpose soil amendment for any kind of plants. So the chemistry is part of it. The biology of wet castings, which is what we produce. A lot of people don't know that, and people don't even ask for that when they ask for lab tests. But worms add bacteria, they add fungi, they add beneficial nematodes to the castings. When they're wet, they will actually inoculate your soil and produce soil biology that's helpful for the plants. Dry castings, dried out castings, don't do that. They're still good for the plants, but they don't have that benefit. It's a secondary, primary benefit, really. When you make castings tea, for example, which we also produce, the whole purpose of that tea is to get a concentrated dose of biological activity into the soil. But the castings themselves are very good for that. They have an enzyme that the worms add called chitinase, and the chitinase has this tricky ability to kill the exoskeleton of pests. Pests eat the chitinase, then their exoskeleton gets actually literally just melts, disintegrates, and they die. So they're very good at preventing pests. They're very good at preventing pathogens. The castings will conserve other nutrients in the soil from decomposing matter, they anchor it in the soil. The water retention, most people don't think too much, but castings in the soil will retain water. I had a guy come in the other day as a regular customer, and he watered his tomato plants, and he had castings in the plants, and he watered them a few days later and drowned them. He didn't pay attention. He drenched them, and they actually drowned. And we had some potato plants in our yard at the shop. And I checked for 3 days, and I stuck my finger in, and like a pool of water came out of the thing. I had overwatered that one. So when he told me that, I had to laugh hysterically. They're very good in this climate. To have something that helps retain water is really, really a good idea. They help balance soil. Ideally, when they come out, they're just under base for, if you know about pH balance, base is 7, so a little bit below that. And they will actually help balance acidic soil or alkaline soil and make it more even. They attract, according to my partner, they will attract, he's seen bugs in his plants that are beneficial insects, they're attracted to the castings. So they're actually able to not only fight off bad pests and nematodes and stuff, but they will also attract good ones. He has, I think, pill bugs, he said he started to see in his garden, and pill bugs are beneficial plants. They're safe, they don't burn. You can put plants in pure castings, but it's not necessary. They're very concentrated. The average thing for making soil out of castings is about 20%. You can mix with compost or anything else, and you can also use them for plant starts. And so they're very safe to use. I know of a woman in California that sells a little bag, a little cellophane front bag with gel caps and castings, and tells people to take them as a supplement. So unless she's killed people, I don't know, but she's gambled on that being something you can do. And finally, and probably in a macro sense, fertilizers, we've all used those things as Npk fertilizers that you get to a store. At a store, eventually, I don't know if you know the history, but we started using them extensively in the 50s in the United States after World War II in Korea. They got fantastic yield results in fields, and we were trying to feed people, and people were looking to produce farms and feed growing populations and so forth. That was, a lot of kids being born, but they found over time that fertilizers strip soil and leave it worse off than it was. And the solution to that for the agricultural industry was to add more, like we do in America. Something's not work, add more and see if that works better. So they kept adding more and more fertilizer. Now they sell drums of liquid fertilizer, and they pour them into ditches and drench them with, water canals, and farmers still do this because they're so used to doing it. Worm castings don't work like that, where you can just pour, drainage, what do you call those things, where they have canals and they open sluice gates and just drench them with water. The castings don't work that way, so it takes a different kind of way of looking at soil. It also, and that also introduces salts. There's all kinds of problems with that, but that started in the 50s, and that's still going on today. But there's some recognition now, more and more, that that's not a way to, we're killing our soil. And so all the plants that were in vegetables and fruit and everything that's coming out of the soil is not as nutritious, because there's a lot of micronutrients and so forth being washed out. Castings improve the soil. They leave it better than you found it. If you put castings in your own raised beds and pots and so forth, it will be better soil for it, not worse. It actually helps it. So I'm preaching to the choir probably, but there's a lot about castings that just make all kinds of sense. And there's a lot more. That the thing about castings is they are an all-purpose soil amendment. They are good for basically almost anything to varying degrees. You may have to add iron, you might have to add zinc, you might have to add some kinds of, you might have to modify what you add to your plants and soils to make them, fit the most optimal nutrition situation. Tomatoes, nightshades take a certain amount of bacteria, but different balances of bacteria and fungal activity. Greens require very little fungal activity, but a lot of bacteria. Trees require balance between bacteria and fungi. So, there's ways of tinkering with and adding to, but castings are good for soil and they're good for plants. Raul, the guy that works with me, says castings are fantastic, even for cactus and succulents. So you can't really go wrong with those things. Now, worms, if you can get worms in your soil, and this is the trick out here, is it's raised beds are the easiest way to raise worms out here. In-ground planting, more difficult. You can do it. You have the potential for whatever eats those things, birds, I don't know, lizards, maybe rodents, they can get in there, and not too many people dig down and add, amended compost or soil to save tree beds or garden beds so much. Whereas with raised beds, you can actually build the soil to a level that they can hide in. They need a fairly thick base of, even though they live on the surface, they need to be able to get away from the weather, to get away from dryness. So they need enough compost and whatever amendments you can add to live in. So they can live in the soil out here. And as I said, Arizona Worm Farm has done an amazing job producing a castings factory with out in the heat of Phoenix. If they can do it, anybody can do it. You can grow worms, and some of you probably have these. If you haven't, you've seen there's many kinds of worm farms now, worm condominiums, worm towers. They're stacked in trays, and you start them in the bottom and you build them up and then feed them, and they keep moving up and up and up. You can take the trays off, get the castings from the bottom tray, and then start over again and put that one on top and start feeding up from the bottom again. There are truncated, can't remember what that's called, but there's ones with a cloth or plastic kind of conical shaped thing like a hopper. You grow the worms, a small number of worms in the bottom, and it may have a little valve that releases castings, and you raise the worms in there. And as it builds up, it gets wider. As there are more worms, it gets wider. You put more food, it keeps going up and up and up. And then you can release castings out of the bottom. And I'm all in favor of, if you raise worms, I like harvesting the castings from the bottom and leaving the worms where they are. Having shoveled worms out of bins for years, I'm not a happy camper doing that all the time anymore. We still do it, but we also have a large tank that produces castings. Castings go down, the worms stay up, and we never have to bother them. And we just keep a cover over the worms and feed them, and that's it. But there are very simple ways to do it on your own. We're scaled up for business, so we have to figure out how to, produce castings and keep the worms happy. We have 70 containers, small containers of worms plus one big tank. If you have one at home, you can take a bucket. My brother, bless his heart, he wanted some worms, and the only reason he wanted them was to eat the food waste that he produces in his apartment that has no yard, no plants, no nothing. He just wanted to eat food waste. And he said people in apartments in cities they don't want to throw out food in the trash. They just don't like it. So I said, what are you going to feed it? And he said, and he had this bucket and he built it with a little tray and a screen, and, it was very engineered. And so I thought, he's taking this seriously. I said, what are you going to feed? He said, well, I eat a lot of oranges, so I'm going to throw orange rinds in. And then I drink a lot of coffee, so the rest of it's going to be coffee grounds. I'm going to put about 10 pounds of that thing in that bucket every time I feed him. I went, oh my God. No. And he said, I know you don't really recommend citrus, which I don't. Nobody does. Citrus is one of the things that you don't feed worms. He feeds citrus rinds and too much coffee. And he feeds a ton of coffee, and that's what he feeds them. And he comes in every once in a while and he brings his worms. He says, okay, have they multiplied or have they subsided or what? They always seem to look healthy, and sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. But that's what I meant by he doesn't, his apartment, he keeps it about between 80 and about 50 degrees. And when it gets too hot, he just brings them back to me and gives them to me again. But through all that, these worms survive and they look pretty good. He brought some in today and they look like they're in pretty good shape. They can withstand quite a bit of abuse, believe it or not. They just don't do what we need them to do, which is to really propagate and produce a ton of castings. But there are all different kinds of ways to do it. You can make them in trays, you can make them in tanks, you can make them in buckets, you can do them in almost anything. You can raise them indoors, they don't stink, the castings don't stink. You don't have to have liquid. People put them under their sinks and closets, they're all over the place. So, worms are pretty versatile that way. The only thing you have to be careful about feeding in certain ways, but so get to that next. Worms need bedding to start. We recommend coconut coir and shredded paper maybe to start. Recommend not feeding green food yet. So we put them, and that's what we do. We put a layer about 4 inches of coconut coir, and I'll add some cardboard sometimes in the middle of that. But coconut coir is very neutral, doesn't heat up, it doesn't produce problems. It's very loamy and porous, and they can move around, and they don't seem to object to it when we get them from other sources. Right now we're feeding manure, we're starting to feed compost. We feed coffee grounds, not like my brother, but some. We feed carbon, which would be paper, cardboard, leaves, even sawdust. And if it's paper, cardboard, we tear it up, wet it, tear it up, and make it smaller. And we feed brewers' grains, which would be spent grains from a brewery. It's barley grains or whatever they have made beer out of. When they dump in their tank, we get some out and we feed a small thin layer of that at the end. Seems to be a protein source. They really like it. One of the ways we check food personally that we've been doing all along is if they eat it, we know it's good for them. And if they don't, they're going to leave a puddle of gelatinous goo in their bin. And what you do is get it out of there before it turns anaerobic and throw it out and don't feed that again. But we did at one time only feed horse manure and coffee grounds, and we grew worms. We had worms. The only thing we didn't know about then was the castings aspect, especially the biology. One time we got a lab report back and he said, you don't have any fungi in your castings. And I said, what do I do? He said, I got one word for you, carbon. I said, I'm on it. We started feeding carbon. Our fungi activity is way up. We had to rinse the manure. We started doing that. We changed the pH balance. We changed the salt levels. So we use those lab reports for us. But in general terms, if you're doing your own worms, you don't have to do all that. You don't have to worry about that. So those are the 5 things we feed. We stay away from citrus. We stay away from hot foods, acidic foods, garlic, no meat, no dairy, no oily foods, etc. Let me see what this says. Yeah, carbon. So, sorry, I'm just now reading some of these. Let me go through these one at a time. Yeah, I think from the egg is laid till it hatches is about 2 to 3 weeks. To answer for that one. We feed them, I think we covered food. We get food from, it's a good question. We get food from wherever we can. I have a guy that delivers manure. We get compost from wherever we get, you would get compost, but we get, a big truck full of it. We get coffee grounds from coffee houses. I have one that's fantastic. They're nice and clean. The only thing in there is the filters. They give me really a lot of it, and it's not full of trash. And we don't need a lot of it. And then we get greens. I used to get it from Whole Foods, and we get it from Time Market. By the way, that's another interesting thing is worms can eat. They don't have to have organic food to produce organic castings. We aren't labeled organic yet, but I talked to Omri, which is the Organic Materials Research Institute some years ago, about the product of castings. And the woman I talked to was the head of the lab. She said, you can feed them almost anything. As long as you don't add anything after, we'll certify it organic. Worms clean up everything. I mean, they do a fantastic job of taking care of stuff. They take care of whatever that comes with the, fertilizers or pesticides, I guess, and they clean it up. They have a very complex enzyme system in their stomachs, and they do amazing things to clean up the food and produce waste that is good stuff. So we're happy with that end, and one day we'll pursue that. But that was eye-opening to me to hear that. We get carbon from where we can get it. We have a woodworking shop near us. We get their sawdust. We get leaves from our neighbor next door. We shovel them up and bring those. Dried leaves are good. We try to stay away from oleander and eucalyptus, certain things. But and carbon in egg cartons. I'm really lucky. I just came from we have a CSA down the street from us, about 2 blocks. And every Wednesday or so, my friend Mary Pat calls and says, will you please come and get all of our egg cartons? They're driving us out of the building. Oh yeah, I can sacrifice myself that way. So they give me these bags full, and we get them out to the car. There's a parade of people carrying them out. And then we just tear them up and use that for that. Carbon. Shredded paper is good. Colored ink is not so good. Black ink is apparently made from soy now, almost universally, so it's food source. Cardboard boxes, if you have a lot of cardboard boxes sitting around, you could shred those up, and they actually like those structural ones with the little, space between the leaves are good, but any cardboard is fine. Not the less dense, probably the better. Brown paper wrapping, stuff like that, it's all pretty good. Did I cover everything? Yeah, and carbon, when you feed worms, a lot of people think, well, we'll just feed food scraps, but they're happier and they'll produce better stuff if you feed them at least as much carbon as you do greens. So they call browns to greens, and you can feed a lot of browns, it's not going to hurt anything. Greens can heat up and heat up the bedding and make it hot. Greens also will more likely spoil. If it's not eaten, it'll degrade, turn anaerobic, whereas carbon doesn't. Carbon will sit there inert. Eventually they'll eat it, and it acts as bedding. It makes the castings and the whole bedding situation more, sort of fluffy and loamy. And then you have your castings, and yeah, eggshells. Yes, eggshells are great. Eggshells are a source of calcium. They're also a source of grit. The only thing, Raul, my friend, he runs them through a coffee grinder. You can run them through a food processor. Whole eggshells are very good for compost, not so good for worms. Everything you feed worms, if you can, make it small. Make it as small as you can. Not soupy. So I've heard somebody talk about a Vitamix. You don't want to turn it into a soupy mix. I don't think that's the right idea, because that liquid is problematic. You do want it. We shred green food in a commercial thing and shreds it into like confetti. Everything else is pretty well small enough size. So that's everything, the coffee grounds, everything is fine enough that they can eat it the way it is. And I don't know if you know, but they eat when it's in the soil, they eat the decay of the food that you put in. And then as it decays, they eat that. And as they eat it, it decays faster. But they do, this whole thing happens pretty fast. That's why if you get small sizes of things, they'll eat it. If worms are doing well and you feed them, feed about a half a pound of food for the number of worms you have. So if you have half a pound of worms, you feed them about a quarter pound of food every 3 or 4 days. Underfeeding is better than overfeeding. Overfeeding produces anaerobic material, doesn't help them. They don't need to eat a ton. So underfeeding is a little better. And if there's, after about 48 hours, if there's any food left over, get it out of there and put something else in, or, feed it later. Maybe there was too much. All that stuff you can experiment. And whatever you put in there, if they don't like it, they'll tell you. they'll let you know in a big hurry. Okay, what else? Worms will, if the environment gets dry, the worms will huddle up. Who was that saying that they were huddling in a corner? Is that you, Mary Beth? Anyway, they'll huddle in a corner and clump together in a ball. And when they start to do that, that's a sign they're basically protecting their skin with moisture. They're basically trying to maintain moisture for each other. Usually that's what the problem is. So watch for, you got a little too dry is worse than a little too wet. A little too wet, they can survive in that. A little too dry is not so good. Too hot, not so good. They can't tolerate fluoride, which thankfully we don't have fluoride around here, but they also can't tolerate chlorine. So if you get the food wet, or if you spritz the thing with fresh tap water, you might have a problem. All you have to do, chlorine is really amazing stuff. It cleans up bacteria in our water supply, and it off gases in 24 hours completely, nothing left. So 24-hour-old water is perfectly good for worms. What else? What else can I talk about? Pets, worm castings are safe, as I said. Even if pets eat worm casting, it's not going to hurt them any. They're very safe for the environment. They're very safe for animals. They're very safe probably for humans, but I'm not going to test it myself. What else have I forgotten here? I feel like I've been talking for a long time. Okay, question. Oh, great question. Worms need to live, they have to have cover. We call it cover. They have to have something around them to keep their skin damp. So if you're raising them in a bed, you're going to have castings, and the castings are usually down below, and the worms, they like to live up. If you can raise them, if you're going for castings, you can raise them to something that's 12 or 14 inches deep. The worms should come up mostly near the top, not absolutely. And then the castings would be on the bottom. You can take the worms off the top. We used to do this with huge 150-gallon tanks. We'd scoop them off the top, put them in something else, shovel the castings out, pick out the worms that were left, and then we had castings. You can also put them in, if you're ambitious, you can put them in a container and make a screen for the bottom, and a pretty loose screen, 1/2 inch or even bigger. And you can raise the worms to the top and take a brush and literally scrape the castings off the bottom, right through the bottom of that screen and out the bottom. You just have to figure out a way to suspend it. We have this huge tank with a grate on the bottom, and that's how we get the castings out, is through that grate. It doesn't have a solid bottom. Okay, something else came here. Yeah, how do you use them? That's a great question as well. Castings are good for building soil at a rate of 20%, but pretty expensive. If you're trying to build a bed of soil, in a raised bed, or for planting, even in pots, at some point you start spending a lot of money on them. They're good for fertilizing, top dressing. They're really good for plant starts. You could put, small seeds, one of those cups in a planting hole with about 2 tablespoons of castings in the bottom. You can mix a little bit with the soil that you put back into the hole. And that's a great way to use them. And then they go a long way that way. And you can also fertilize later with them if you have some left over. They last for a long time. I would say at least 6 months, up to maybe a year. They have a pretty long shelf life. The main thing about them is they need to be damp. They have to be kept damp. So if you don't use them, put them in a container, pour a little water in there, shake them around, and then just keep them damp, not sopping wet, but damp. And that'll keep any bacterial, you have organisms in those castings, and if they dry out, the organisms die. So they're still good for chemistry, but they're not good for biology anymore. So that's the best way. And we do have, if you're making your own castings, you can make your own soil base with compost and even native soil for trees. You can add it to other ingredients to make your base for larger plants and for trees. We screen the castings so we get the finest product that we sell for, pretty expensively compared to other things. And we also have a less expensive one that's a byproduct. It still comes from the castings from the containers, but it's got undigested food in it and pebbles in it and sticks in it. And it's got more like balls of castings, pebbles of castings, which serve the purpose of they actually will last longer in the soil. They won't break down as fast. And they also have, the texture of them is a lot fluffier. So if you're growing castings and they have that fluffy kind of granular quality, that's really good stuff for building soil with as well. Wow, I'm out of breath. Hi.
I have a question.
Yes.
So how do you make compost, or not compost tea? How do you make casting tea?
Great question. You can, if you buy casting tea, you can take about, we've been thinking about this. We make it ourselves, but we have an industrial strength thing that throws like a tornado through the tea. So it makes a really dense, really rich stuff. If you do it at home, my recommendation is get a 5-gallon bucket, figure out how much tea you want, and add about a cup of castings for each gallon of tea that you want. And then go to a pet store and buy an aquarium pump. It costs about between $13 to $17. They're for aerating aquariums. You can get a stone for the bottom. I would make sure that stone goes to the bottom and so it balances, it shoots air out. If you get a bigger one, they're not even expensive for pretty high powered ones. If you're making a lot of it all the time, you can spend $29 or $30 and get a real one with some serious jet action. And then it stirs it up and that will produce the tea. You can also add a tiny bit of fish emulsion to the castings at the beginning. Fish emulsion is also a very safe, low intensity fertilizer and will produce bacterial activity. And there's other things that we put in ours. We put in azumite and kelp meal, various things in it, bat guano. So this is my friendly assistant he's kind of a mad scientist for teas. He gets online and he finds all these formulas for things. I'm adding this to my tea now. And when you get halfway through, do this. But you can also just make it out of nothing but castings. And I would add, if I were adding one thing, I'd say fish emulsion would be the other thing I would add, just because it's very safe. Now, some people, you might read or hear that people add unsulfured blackstrap molasses. Obviously it's a dense sugar, and dense sugars can produce a lot of bacterial activity. But if you're not there, I have one woman it's my resource for things like this. She's not sure that that's such a good thing. Some people think that might be a little bit dangerous because you can introduce pathogens, and those sugars can actually start eating the other bacteria that you're trying to grow. But I've also heard that it's a great way to make castings tea. So as you can tell, I'm a little waffling about that one. I probably won't, we don't do it anymore. I did originally, but I don't do it anymore. So yeah, you can make your own castings tea, and castings tea is great. It's inoculates the soil. If you have plants that you're having trouble with the growing area, or you want to inoculate a bed or a tree bed, and you think that the soil's kind of shot, you make 5 gallons of tea and just pour it in that soil. It's a great way to get it started. And you want it planted, you want a plant in the soil, and then you want mulch after that to protect it. And there are interactions between plant roots and the biology in the soil and the minerals in the soil. And don't ask me questions about all this. It's extremely complicated. It's really, it's a whole thing. This book, I'll show you this, The Soul of Soil. Is that reading correctly? It's a beginner's edition, and oh my God, I started reading, I thought, uh-oh, better get out of this. So we have a zone of a certain kind of soil, and it has to be treated a certain way. You know, all of you have grown plants successfully around here, so you know what you're doing. You already know what you're doing. But there's a lot you could, if you really want to dig in and find out about it, you can read that or read some of the, I'll put references for, especially Rhonda Sherman is the name of the person. I'll hold this up, but Marty and Mary Beth will put it on the website. But this is the Worm Farmer's Handbook. She's the one that at North Carolina State, she's my resource for anything about worms, because she's conservative. She doesn't, you know, she does her homework. She's had conferences with people from everywhere, including the guy from Arizona Worm Farms is a legitimately very good company. They're a great company. Zach, the guy that owns that place, is fabulous. They're really, you know, all in with, they have plants and trees and compost and chickens. I mean, they have the whole enchilada. They're really good up there. It's worth it. If you ever want to do a field trip for any of this, go up to Phoenix, go to Arizona Worm Farms, and then walk across the street to Seamus O'Leary's exotic trees and plants. I mean, it's incredible. You got gorgeous plants up there. But they're very good in Arizona. They are very good at answering questions, dealing with things, and they have a lot of the same things we do. So I really appreciate my relationship with them. But they're the only other ones I know of in Arizona doing this. We're the only ones in Southern Arizona. I don't know of anybody else in Flagstaff or any other place that's doing this. So I don't really know why. I think it's just because its time hadn't come, and now its time has come. So we're finally, people are really waking up to what it can say. When you get a bag of, oh, good question. How do you continue working? Did I answer the question about castings and tea adequately? Okay.
I have another question. I'm sorry, I'm not using the chat
No,
to ask my questions, but so are there any like farms that use worm castings? Are that as a soil amendment? You know, is it used industrially on like regular farms?
That's a really good question. I can't answer that. I think, really honestly, I hate to say it, but farms are so large and they're so inculcated with their barrels of, you know, the way they water, the way they irrigate, their barrels of, you know, fertilizers that they get, liquid fertilizers. Even, you know, I've talked to golf courses, and even they have a way of doing it. They've been doing it this way. Their father did it this way. Their other guy did it this way. They're really into it. And castings, you know, the people that started said the same thing. You can't really just flood property with worm castings on it. You're going to just wash them all away. I mean, you have to treat them with, you know, differently. You have to water differently. You have to put in conservative water systems, put the castings in, and not just pour water across the ground and wash everything down into the aquifer or whatever, or down the river. I don't think so. I don't think large farms are doing this. Interesting point. I did talk to a worm farm. I don't know if you know anything about golf, but there's a course called Augusta National. It's in Augusta. It's the preeminent golf course in the world. It's the most beautiful. Looks like you want to see a garden, boy. If you turn that on television, you see dogwood trees and these hedges. And I mean, it's like something out of looks like it's man-made. And they use worm castings for all their landscaping. They don't use it for the golf course. And I know the people that they use their castings from. So it can be used to some scale, but it has to be, it has to be re-education of our whole agricultural system. And probably the answer to that, a lot of it has to do with teas, not dry castings, but tea. You can make hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of gallons of tea and inoculate soil. So that's kind of what we're thinking. People do that. They do that. Keeping castings damp, if they dry out and you can get them wet again, but I think you have to re-inoculate them to get the bacterial activity back up. Inoculating means there's a product called EM, which is it's a bottle. It's expensive and it's got trillions of bacteria in it. And you can dilute it and spray it into your castings and re-inoculate it. You can use it dry too. You can use it afterward. And it still has the chemistry benefit. So it's still like a good fertilizer. You don't need to use castings right away. Like I said, they have a long shelf life. They will last for months. As long as you keep them damp, they'll maintain their integrity. I've read someplace, some guy put castings in his pots in his house, and they didn't put anything more in for 3 or 4 years. They didn't do anything more to their soil for years after that. I wouldn't go that long, but the castings have a long shelf life. Tea has no shelf life. So making your own tea is a good idea if you can do it. If you can't do it or don't want to do it, you can order it from us and pick it up the same day we finish brewing it, take it home and use it. Ours is probably stronger, but tea does not have much of a shelf life, even though there are companies that are producing something called worm tea that's supposed to last for 30 days. And we're looking at each other going, how in the world is that possible? That shouldn't be possible. So we don't know about that. The EM product is a concentrated product you can get at Eco Grower around town for Grower's House. And that seems to last for a while. I don't know how they do it, but there is a way of doing it. So, but we don't know how to make tea. The best we've been able to, the longest I've read is about 2 days, 2 or 3 days of shelf life. The only benefit, the main benefit of tea is it's cheap and you can do a ton of inoculation with it. For $15 for ours, you can put 15 gallons of water around your tree wells or around whatever. So it goes a long way. It's good that way. Okay, let's see. Yeah, you need to use tea preferably within 10 minutes of when you get it. That woke everybody up.
Yeah.
The sooner you use it, the better off you are. If you don't use it, and you can't let it get in the sun will kill the microorganisms. If you don't use it, you can refrigerate it overnight. You can use it. There have been experiments done. Rhonda Sherman knew a guy that found that tea actually increased microbial activity in the refrigerator, and then it decreased later on. But I wouldn't fiddle around personally. I would just get it when I need it and use it, or make your own tea, on your own schedule. But we pour all that other stuff in, so we got our magic formula. Just like
Michael, I have a question.
Yeah,
I'm a little confused, sorry,
sure.
about if your castings dry out.
Yes.
I don't understand what you're saying about biology versus chemistry.
Okay.
And what can I still use them without putting EM into it?
Yes.
Okay.
Castings have two components. One is really it's nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, plus boron, zinc, sodium, whatever all else. There's a whole cadmium. There's a whole bunch of minerals, micronutrients and minerals that castings have, and so do fertilizers to some degree, but usually they're NPK only. Castings have a lot of micronutrients, and I think the enzyme that they have, the chitinase, I think all that stuff comes with dry castings.
Right.
Wet castings also have bacteria
Okay.
and fungi and beneficial nematodes. So
Okay.
that's living, that's organisms.
Right.
The other stuff is not alive. It's basically inert. Those are the things that die off if it dries out. So you don't know if they dry out, you can still use them. We were trained to use dry castings at the beginning. We didn't know at that point how this whole thing worked. If you buy them at a store, sometimes they're dried out, and they're still valuable, but not nearly as valuable as they are when they have the bacterial and fungi activity.
So making a tea once it's dry does not
No,
make it like wet.
no.
Okay,
Yeah,
I got it.
Yeah,
I
I wouldn't
get it.
make tea. Yeah, good. That's a good question. Yeah, don't make tea out of dry castings or reenact, just get it soaking wet. It's not going to be the same thing as
Okay,
you have to keep it wet to keep everything in there alive.
okay, thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you. How am I doing? Any other questions?
Yeah, Claudia asked a question about, can castings be used as soon as they are harvested?
Oh, sure. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, you can use them if you harvest them yourself with your own worms, or if you get them from us, yeah, just use them whenever you want immediately, but you don't have to. So you can use them right away. Oh, yes, definitely. I never would have thought of that, but that's a good question. Yeah, what else? Let me look at my prompts for my friends. That is the thing about, I don't know about, nematodes can be tricky. They can actually eat other beneficial stuff, but there are beneficial ones too. They eat grubs, yeah, possibly. I can't answer that question. I'm sorry. Somebody asked if they eat the grubs in the soil, and I think nematodes can eat pests. They can eat pathogens and pests in the soil. Nematodes, I believe, are exoskeleton. They're tiny little creatures with exoskeletons. That's a good question. There's a lot I don't know about how those things interact. I just know that you want fungal activity in the castings and in the soil, and bacteria in the castings and in the soil. That's how your plants are going to be the healthiest, and to different various ratios. And that's something you can find out from a plant biologist, or even you can research it online.
Is the fungal activity related to mycorrhizae?
Mycorrhizae is fungal is the interaction between the roots and the fungal activity in the soil. So mycorrhizal, I can't even pronounce it, is an indicator of soil health, and in that interplay. And mycelium is a kind of a network of fungus in the soil. Sometimes you'll see mycelium, white strands of stuff in your soil. That's a good sign. And you can actually buy mycorrhizal, whatever, in some form. You can buy it and add it to your soil mix. I don't know where you get it, but you can. Maybe Arbico would have it. Maybe EcoGrow would have it, but you can add it, and it is a function of soil health. It is an indication of soil health. But now you're getting on the edge of my knowledge as to how all this works. I'm more a worm guy. I don't understand that much about the soil exchange, the cation exchange, and the different elements. Yeah, so Mesquite Valley, Susan said that Mesquite Valley growers had mycorrhizal. If they have it, a grower's house would probably have it, Eco Grow would probably have it, you could get it, and I'm guessing Arbico too. Arbico's now they've expanded, they're not just doing ladybugs and beneficial insects, they're doing more, they're doing compost, they have a compost operation, so they probably have. We're lucky, we have pretty good resources in this area for that. I had a question. How often should you add worm castings to your plants? The only time you might not want to add them, you could really add them every 3 to 6 months. The one time you might not want to is right before it starts to get really cold. You might not want plants flowering right before it gets cold, so you don't get freeze burns and so forth. But other than that, I don't think it matters too much. If they're dormant, if they're plants that go dormant, you might not want to fertilize them then. But other than that, every 3 to 6 months. Another one. Every day. You can do, somebody I heard was doing tea like once a week. I mean, just splashing tea on their yard every week. I think Arizona Worm Farms has a big tank, and they produce a big tank full of tea, and then they take a hose and spray it around like firefighters putting out a plant fire. So that's the thing about this, is you can't do anything wrong with it you can't overdo it. So it's really amazing that way. There aren't too many things like that are beneficial and really pose no risk. Can you use other types of fertilizers with worm castings? This is my daughter and her friends threw me some prompts, and another friend. Yes, you can. It's a good idea to actually, depending on the specialized needs of plants, to find out what they need, because castings don't provide everything in every way. Roses are one thing that comes to mind. They need a certain amount of iron, right, in their environment. I think roses are finicky that way, for example, and maybe certain kind of vegetables might need a splash of something else. So they're not going to produce. They're not Uncle Ben's miracle tonic from the back of the wagon. They are good for soil. They are good for plants. They are good for pest control. They are good for a lot of things, but they're not everything for every plant. So you do have to kind of do a little research on that. And the best way is to find a really good nursery that knows what they're doing. I wish Ralph was still here from Catalina Heights from many years ago. He was the smartest guy I know about that. But there are people that do. The people at Eco Grow in their domain are very good. And I think a lot of people are good for, hope I can do commercial endorsements without getting in trouble. Have I covered everything, or is there more? Mary Beth, yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Jared over there at Spadefoot he's good. He knows the stuff. It's absolutely right. Small nurseries, you're going to find, you just have to really kind of pick and choose and find somebody that knows what they're doing. So usually they have, like Green Things, that has one guy I think that is pretty good, knows what he's doing. I don't know as much about Mesquite Valley. They seem to be just a factory producing a lot of stuff, but I don't know. They have nice stuff there, but I've never talked to them or looked for some expertise in that way. And we do have, strangely, we have an agricultural school here with the U of A. They don't have a vermiculture operation. As far as I know, they don't do worms or worm castings. They don't have it, but they might have resources for plantings and for plant biology. They should have. They have great people for that. So, anybody else have anything?
Any other questions for Michael?
I'm terrified somebody's going to come up with something. I have no idea what you're talking about.
I have a worm story that I'd like to share. And I have relatives in Iowa. And so this is where this story came from. And my cousin is a farmer, and he and his grandson were out in the field, and he saw his grandson going like this with his hands. And Ben said, "Abe, what you got there?" And Abe said, "A worm." "Well, what are you doing?" He goes, "I'm petting it." He was petting his worm, just like putting it in a ball.
That's amazing. I've done a couple of school, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna throw out another worm story. When I lived in Apache Junction, my neighbor, we were out in the country, started a business. He was raising worms, but these were fishing worms that he was raising,
Yeah.
not for soil. So I don't know what they were, night crawlers. I don't know where he got his starts, but he built a shed that was as big as his house in square footage, and had these raised beds basically inside. He bought in truckloads of manure and straw, and he chopped it all up and mixed it together. And then I don't know whether it was intentional or something, but one night there were no lights above these critters. And so at night they came up out of those raised beds and migrated. They went someplace else. He learned that he had to keep lights on top of them, so
Yeah.
they thought it was daylight all the time. But
So his investment flew away, basically. Oh no, poor guy.
We had a breakout twice in 3 days. We had a bunch of worms crawl out of their bins and roll over the floor. And one time I got my son in, I said, "Hey, Oren, I got a job for you." And they're so amazing. They crawled out of the totes in our breeding room, and they crawled around the room, and they clustered up in like almost like, I don't know how to put it, but like in strands, like woven strands around the legs of the shelving and around the wheels and in the corners and the walls. And then they crawled out. And they don't like castings. They don't like worm castings. They crawled out of the room and up the side and right into a bucket of castings. I couldn't even believe it. It's like wormicide. I couldn't believe what they were doing. I think they're punishing me for doing something. We'll show you. We're just going to commit suicide in a bucket of castings. Really teach you a lesson.
Wow.
And we didn't know. We've chalked that up to a change of barometric pressure because it was during the monsoon season, so they can't react to that apparently. Went to a worm farm back in Georgia, and they had lights on over their outdoor worm grows all the time, full time, like Christmas tree lights or something over it. So they're funny. They're very resilient, but they're also surprise you sometimes with what they'll do. like you're his friend.
Well, I would just like to say, if you haven't seen Michael's operation when he has an open house, it's fascinating. It's really a great place, and it's in Midtown. It's not like way out in the boonies or anything. It's really easy to get to, and it's just fun to see what he's doing. So
yeah, it's sometimes it costs me a little bit, but I'm happy to have anybody in there and talk to people and show people around. I'm not selling. I'm not Walmart trying to sell widgets to people, get them in and out. We're kind of in the relationship business, both of us. Raul's worse than I am. He'll talk to people for an hour about things. I only give half an hour. But we're happy to have people come in anytime, and you can check our website and see some information. It's not as informative as I'd like. It's funny, I've done some school presentations, and kids really get interested in worms. I mean, this is one of the more exciting things is that kids really they they see them and they want to hold them and they want to look at them and they just don't understand what this is all about, but they're mesmerized, and that to me is an invitation to relationship with the natural world, relationship with an animal, composting, soil, the whole thing. So my goal is to make this a stable, viable business, but then to do outreach, to help community gardens, to help schools, to help with education, to do anything we can to make this so people are, Tucsonans are really getting on board with us. I mean, we're really fortunate in the last couple of years. People have really responded fantastically well, some of you included, obviously. So we're very lucky that way. We hope to contribute something back and keep this culture going.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a
I
great
hope-
evening.
I
Great
hope so.
presentation.
Thanks very much,
Absolutely.
Maureen. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay,
We'll see you soon.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. I think that's it for tonight. Thank you, everyone, for being with us, and appreciate Michael's imparting all his wisdom about worms. So much to learn. Thank you so much. Everybody have
Not
a
for
good
all of
evening.
us. Thank you.
Yes.